Welcome to the Codeland Fireside Chat with Tracy Chou, founder and CEO of Block Party, which builds anti-harassment tools for social media. Tracy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So today we're going to talk about surviving and thriving, being an idealist in tech. And we're going to try to provide the audience with authentic, useful feedback and, stories. And we're going to start with your backstory. So you have been part of, some really interesting historical technology companies, but can you kind of tell us about how it all started?
In some ways, it feels like I had this charmed path into Silicon Valley and tech. I actually grew up in the Bay Area. Both my parents were software engineers, did a startup way back in the day. My high school, later after I was there, actually even invested in the seed round of Snap. And so it's kind of a crazy world that I came from. Um, in school, I studied engineering. I studied electrical engineering, computer science. Um, and from all of those sorts of like external descriptors, it seems like it would be a very obvious path into tech. Um, that being said, I actually did face a lot of the headwinds of sexism and bias, which early on I didn't really identify. I wasn't aware enough to even know things like imposter syndrome or systemic bias. But the pull of Silicon Valley was strong enough still, and having some technical skills, I still got pulled into working at tech companies and startups. So my first job out of school was at a then tiny startup, Quora. I was the fifth person on the team, working just in engineering, building whatever needed to be built. After that, I went to Pinterest. Again, pretty small startup at the time. It was about 10 people when I joined. Stuck around for a pretty fun rocket ship ride there, and was there for 4.5 years. By the time I left, it was 1,000 people. So again, like on the engineering side, super fun to be all over the stack, building and scaling. In parallel to that, in these first couple of jobs I had working full time in industry, I started to see the issues around diversity and inclusion as broader technology industry wide things, not just individual problems that I was experiencing. So it is a common thing for women in particular to internalize failure and externalize success compared to men who might internalize success and externalize failure. When I was sometimes observing things around, I don't feel like I'm treated the same way, or that my opinions are heard as much, I would originally blame myself and think maybe it's because I'm not experienced enough, I'm new, I'm junior, I didn't study computer science in my undergrad. And it took a while for me to understand that these were industry problems, not my problems. And so in the course of these jobs, starting to be awakened to some of these broader issues, I started becoming more of an advocate around diversity and inclusion, partly just for the personal selfish reasons of wanting more diversity around me to have better, more comfortable teams and working environments, but also seeing what the impact was on the products we were building. So lack of diversity and representation on our teams meant that when we were trying to make product decisions, we only had a very limited set of perspectives to draw on. There were cases where my teammates would turn to me and ask questions like, "So Tracy, what do women want?" Because I was the only woman in the room. And obviously I would do my best to try to reflect half the global population, but that's not really the best way to build products, to have such a limited worldview represented. So one of the major efforts I ended up kicking off as part of that diversity inclusion work was the big push to get diversity data from tech companies. So prior to my work there, anybody who worked in tech, who'd ever stepped foot on any tech company campus, could tell you that there was a diversity problem, but without any data to quantify it, it's very easy to ignore and pass off as not a real thing. Now we're in the cadence of tech companies releasing diversity data so we can see how bad it is and how little progress we're making. Or, more optimistically, the fact that there is some progress is also good. Later, I also co-founded a nonprofit called Project Include, which works with tech startups on implementing diversity and inclusion. now I am working on a new startup of my own that's trying to build tech tools to combat online harassment and just broadly more ensure online safety, which really feels like a lot of these different threads coming together around building technology products, trying to incorporate the viewpoints and needs of more marginalized populations. But these different threads of trying to still be an idealist, trying to be more ethical and build for more than just the capitalist pursuit of making money have always been there.
So let's back up to before your work with the diversity data, with Project Include. What was the dialogue around these subjects at the time? I think there's certain progress has been made. There's still a lot of work to do and maybe some fake progress in certain areas. But what about, zooming way back? Like, what was it like talking about this stuff either in person or on the internet, back then?
Yeah, I would say about 10 years ago, the conversation was not very advanced around diversity. A lot of people would still deny that it was a problem. Um, some of this was out of maybe selfish interest to not want to recognize that there were problems that should be addressed. For example, when I talked about sexism in the workplace in tech, I was told that it didn't actually exist and that I wanted to believe that it existed, and therefore I was projecting sexism around me. So there was still that level of denial. Then, even when we did talk about diversity, people would often automatically jump to the conclusion that you meant gender diversity. And so if you talk about diversity, people would say, oh, yes, like, I hire women. Like, I think women are great. Women are equal. That was kind of where the conversation ended. Not a lot of recognition around the value of diversity. It was viewed as purely a sort of like moral, feel good thing that would get deprioritized in favor of like business. There would be the people who would say like, diversity it's unrelated to the business. This is just like politics and things that we shouldn't really be spending any of our time talking about. Over the course of the last 10 years, it has been really heartening to see that conversation, the discourse has advanced, become much more nuanced. People understand diversity much more than just gender diversity. Racial diversity is obviously much more at the forefront of people's thinking now, particularly with Black Lives Matter and a lot more awareness of the racial inequities that we need to address in society. A lot more folks understand what intersectionality is, this idea that people have these different facets of their identity and lived experiences that intersect. So my experience as an Asian woman in engineering is different than just a sort of generic Asian experience or just a woman's experience. And there are specific things about that intersection of being an Asian woman. Beyond that, I would say there's also a deeper understanding that diversity intersects with what we're working on in much deeper ways, where the quality of the products that we're building will be vastly improved for having greater diversity. There's more of a thread around ethics in the conversation as well, looking at how more marginalized populations, often coming from underrepresented identities, have very unique perspectives to add into these conversations around harms that they've experienced or can foresee. And so I feel like there's a lot more discussion now, even if we don't have the solutions yet, around these problems we have around like AI technologies that are biased because of the data sets being biased, or different pathologies that can result from even just like the structure of the models that are being trained. So I do think that discourse has advanced a lot. Sometimes it can be frustrating, and I hear this. I felt this, and I've heard this from a lot of other people, that there's this hypocrisy, that gap between what people are saying is important and what is actually done. So people will mock this, make memes out of it. Like, it's common to poke fun at the companies that have all these like corporate Black Lives Matter posts, but not really following through yet, things like that. And I totally feel that hypocrisy, but I think it's actually quite a sign of the advancement that has happened, that people feel like it's the right thing to talk about as like diversity being important, and they at least feel like they need to make a show of it. Whereas 10 years ago, people would have just kind of like brushed it off and said, this is not a priority, like this is not important to the business at all. Whereas at least that has advanced to a point where people generally think that it's important to say that diversity is good, even if the follow through isn't totally there yet.
So let's talk about getting into tech right now. In today's climate, uh, what's the advice you'd offer anyone just starting out right now?
Oh, this is tricky. I think one of the difficult things is, I think it's true of all engineering, this idea of like having to understand trade-offs. Um, never, you're never going to have everything be perfect. And to the theme of this discussion around being an idealist, sometimes it can be frustrating to feel like you're compromising or that things are not as ideal as you want them to be. I've seen many younger folks entering industry become really disillusioned when they enter workforces or teams that they had heard would be really good and equitable, diverse. And it's not that those teams or the organizations are going to aren't good or aren't better than a lot of what else is out there, but nothing's perfect. And I think a bit of that dose of pragmatism is useful to have. I think there's also a lot of discourse now around not working hard because you want to maintain work-life balance and mental health, and you don't want to be exploited by industry or by your manager. And well, I do think it's really important for people to understand where they themselves are and be mindful of burnout and working too hard. I think there's a lot of entering industry being a junior and like trying to get that head start in your career, which is working hard. And I don't want to tell people to not work hard when it may be something that's really advantageous for them. We talk a lot about working smart, not working hard, but sometimes it's working smart and working hard, and making sacrifices there. Of course, it's everyone's choice what they want to do, but I think for me and for many of the folks I've seen around me, that willingness to work very hard in the early days laid a really important foundation of learning and growth. And so I think there's a bit there which like feels like it's at tension with some of the other things we're hearing, which are much more idealistic around. Like you can have it all. You can have this life outside of work. You can establish very firm boundaries. You can travel and see the world on your great tech salary. And there are going to have to be trade-offs. You can't have everything at once. And it's just important for you, especially if you're early in career, to understand what are the trade-offs you're willing to make and what are the things that are the most important. We often talk about priorities in various contexts, whether it's personal priorities or company priorities. And we sometimes have a tendency to list out everything that we want as a priority, but I just want to point out that a priority has to be something that is prioritized over something else. And so you can't actually prioritize everything. Like you could at most pick like 2 or 3 things that you're really going to prioritize. And then it means other things will be deprioritized.
How might someone recognize the difference between uh, a healthy trade-off and an unhealthy compromise, or putting themselves in the wrong situation?
Oof. I don't think there's any easy answers on this because so much of it is contextual and depends on each person. A rule of thumb that I've heard before and I think has been helpful to me sometimes is if you're feeling for too long, let's say like 6 months or more, that you're unhappy constantly, then it might be time to reconsider whether there are some parameters you want to change, whether that's the role you're in or the company you're in, or even the industry. Even then, though, I think it's a bit tricky to define the right cutoffs. I think even in my personal experience, if I had drawn the cutoff at 3 months or 6 months, it might have been too early. And sometimes it was, I just needed to push through a little bit longer to get to a better spot. And I've heard the stories of people who worked at Facebook in 2007 and were frustrated and left before everything took off there, then deeply regretted not having just like stuck it out a little bit longer, or, substituted whatever successful tech company you want to around. Like there was a period of time before it felt like it was really taking off. And one of the things that also happens with tech companies, I think, is that growth can mask a lot of other issues. And so when periods of a company's growth are shakier, it doesn't feel like things are as much like up and to the right, then other concerns around the culture or how the team functions or your individual role can feel more important. When a company is completely taking off and all the metrics around growth, engagement, revenue are amazing, then people have a lot more tolerance for other things not being as great. And so really, it depends on so many factors for you as an individual, how you're feeling, what's your mental health like, what are you willing to tolerate, what are your individual interactions like with your teammates and your manager, the leadership where you are, or the industry writ large. How is the company doing? Like there's so many different questions to look at there. One thing that can also be helpful is to just cross-check with other people. One thing I found very helpful to start to understand some systemic issues that are happening across tech when early on I was still pretty naive, was talking to other female engineers at startups and starting to understand, my experiences are not unique. Things that I thought were my problem as an individual, there's something about me that was wrong and that I wasn't cut out for software engineering or startups or tech. These questions kind of went away when I realized that other people were having the same experience that I was. And so having that validation was really helpful. I think now it's a lot easier to find people who are willing to speak about their experiences. So sometimes it's even just like looking on different platforms like Twitter or Instagram or wherever people are talking about things and finding that validation that your experiences are not necessarily unique. But also it is really helpful to connect with folks and be each other's support network. So they're kind of like the two steps there, like the validation, then like the support. And with this network of people, it also becomes more clear whether the situation you're in is one that you want to stay in or not. If you start to realize that like everywhere across the industry is kind of the same and it's something that we need to fix, there are problems that you're experiencing we need to fix across the entire industry, then obviously making a move to a different company is not going to help that much. But you can also start to see if it's something that is more unique to where you are and into something that's easier to change that parameter.
What went into the choice to become outspoken enough? Because as far as trade-offs go in terms of your personal career, I'm sure that, those are pretty big decisions.
I would say earlier on in my career, I was not particularly wise. And so I would not say that all of those decisions were very well considered. But I had this feeling that I just wanted to speak up or share my experiences and that was a good thing to give voice to. There were definitely repercussions for speaking up about wanting more diversity. I've gotten pushback in the workplace. I've gotten pushback from colleagues. I can't say for sure what's happened in conversations in rooms where I wasn't present, but I'm almost certain that there have been opportunities that I've lost out on because of being more vocal and speaking up and ruffling some of the wrong feathers. I've dealt with the anonymous trolls and I've had people write scathing anonymous reviews of me. And so that is a choice I have made. I've chosen to continue doing those things despite seeing what the repercussions have been. So now it is more well considered when I think about what are these trade-offs I'm making. And I think a lot of what drives me here is recognizing that I do have a lot of privilege and was very fortunate to grow up in the environment I did with the privileges I had, to continue to have so many opportunities unlocked for me. I think going to the right institution, so being lucky enough to go to Stanford, being in Silicon Valley, being at some of these like brand name companies has really opened a lot of doors for me. And I have these privileges that not everybody has. And that makes it easier for me to speak on some of these issues. It gives me a little bit more social capital, credibility, and power. Um, it's harder, I think, for some folks to dismiss me in saying some of the things that I say because they can't discredit me based on like, oh, like you just don't have the background to understand, or you're not in a position that you can understand. You just want a handicap to be able to have things go your way a little bit more easily. And so I don't want to feel guilty about privileges that I've had, but I also want to pay them forward as much as possible and understand that I'm in a position where I can take a little bit more of this pushback. Um, that being said, it is still a bit of a choice to choose not just discomfort, but sometimes misery. Like it's not easy, um, particularly now in like the work I'm doing around online safety and anti-harassment. Every time we do a launch for Block Party, we talk about some of these like anti-harassment tools we're building. A lot of harassers come along and they're very upset that we are building tools to help defend against them. And even in just doing launches for Block Party that are very sort of like standard product hunt type launches or Reddit AMA, I've dealt with it's like onslaughts of abuse. And people have asked me, people who are very close to me have asked me, like, why do you put yourself through this? Like, you don't have to do this. This is like very miserable. Investors also don't really understand what you're doing. There are some who will, but you're solving a problem that doesn't affect the majority white male population of investors. So it's going to be harder to convince them. I have to, so I, thinking through all this, like I have deliberately made a bunch of choices that make my life more difficult, but it also feels very meaningful. And for me, that is something I'm willing to make that trade off on. I'm going to work on something that's harder, less lucrative, but much more meaningful. And that gets me up every day, gets me through all the lows. People talk about like the ups and downs of startup life. Honestly, sometimes it feels like it's just all downs, and then the ups you can't even really enjoy because there's so many more downs to come. Um, so feeling like I have a sense of purpose, I'm able to exert some agency, and pay forward some of the privileges I've had is what gets me through. But it's not easy.
So, this sense of purpose has kept you going as an idealist. You bundled a lot of your experience and turned it into a startup that you're pretty uniquely qualified to uh, take on in a lot of ways. What was it like really ultimately making the choice to take on this as the next stage in your career?
The story of founding a startup is usually never as simple as the retrospectives make it seem. It's always very easy to have these stories written afterwards of how people were so motivated from like their childhood to work on some particular problem. It's not quite so easy, but for me, some of the things I was thinking about were one, actually just like being in the startup world. I'd been in a couple of really early stage startups and seen them um, become really interesting platforms and vectors for achieving impact. And coming from an engineering background, I could see the power of like building these products that serve populations at scale. And so there's something very appealing there of startups as a vehicle to create change. And then there's also just looking at the problems I was experiencing personally and that do disproportionately affect minoritized populations. So specifically around online abuse, it was a problem that I experienced personally, particularly doing diversity and inclusion work and becoming a bit of a target for trolling. And also, I was seeing that many other women and minorities were dealing with very similar problems. And because the tech industry doesn't have the level of diversity and inclusion that we would want, it was also not as well equipped to solve some of these problems. And so it felt like there is this really nice intersection for me of my work experiences and skill sets around product and engineering, my personal experiences in dealing with online safety issues, and then startups as this vehicle for change, being able to align people around this mission. And then, like, obviously also from the business side, because I had worked at platform companies, understanding where that opportunity was, where there's a set of problems that platforms themselves will never be incentivized to solve because of their business metrics that they're trying to optimize. It felt like there was a really unique opportunity here. And then looking at the broader social impact, social media, online platforms are so embedded in our everyday lives now. They are significant in things like democracy and information and public health. And that as a sort of like intermediate layer of everything that we do, being so flawed, is very appealing to me as something to work on. And we're in a lot of really interesting conversations now around how do we fix social media. Clearly, some things are broken, and it's something that touches all of us, whether very directly because, let's face it, like most of us are on these platforms way too much, or indirectly because they do shape society, elections, misinformation, whatever, all that. We're in this really interesting creative period now around how do we solve these really difficult, in some ways they seem intractable problems that are not just technical problems, but sort of societal problems, policy problems, personal issues. It's a really fun space to be in, and feels very motivating to be at this juncture, and looking into the future and trying to define what is a vision for the world that we should be aiming for, and then helping to try to achieve that.
So when I've checked in on what's going on with Block Party, sometimes you're talking about uh, when I just chat with you about this, I followed along a little bit. Sometimes you're talking about how fundraising is going. Sometimes you're talking about getting harassed on Reddit, and then sometimes you've talked about scaling Python workers, as the challenge at hand. So can you kind of speak to just like what the day to day is in building this company that's so founded in idealism, but is also about writing Python and React and getting people on the same page and enjoying the process and yeah, just what's it been like?
Yeah, that's really cool for you to call out, just sort of like the behind the scenes of getting something built. There is obviously that organizing principle and the mission, the product that we're building, but there's just all the sort of like day-to-day startup stuff that needs to happen that every startup has to do. The first phase of the company, I was writing a lot of the code because that was the way to bring it into the world. And so in those early days, it was writing a lot of back-end code, a lot of infrastructure type work, trying to figure out how to like scale up, pulling data from an external data service and synchronizing it with our own servers, and also obviously building on the front end so that users can interact with our product. There's that sort of like initial product validation of, are we on the right track to solving a real problem with this version of the product that we're building? And then the execution part of it, which is like, you need to have some idea of the designs and the implementation on the engineering front. There's also the parts of building a startup, which are building up the team around you. There's a limit to what any one person can do. And so a lot of the success of a company is going to be like, how good are you attracting the right people? So I've also spent a lot of time on recruiting and building out the team, managing the team, making sure we're organized. All of our processes are very efficient. we started off as fully distributed, even before the pandemic made all of us become distributed. But my prior work experiences were also all like in-person, like co-located spaces, offices. And so there's a lot of like figuring out, how do we be effective? How do we build good team culture and processes in a distributed environment? How do we change those and adapt those like as we grow the team? And how do we do that internationally across many time zones? So a lot of just like figuring out those kinds of things, like when do we have meetings when we span 9 time zones? How do we make sure that action items are followed up on and that we are efficient with the limited in-person, or not in person, but the synchronous time that we have, like in Zoom calls? There's a lot of like figuring out those things. And there's all the sort of like execution bits around the rest of the company. So past the initial product building phase is starting to move into like, how do we build a business out of this? Like, what are the core assumptions we need to validate around people's willingness to pay? What's the right pricing model and the price points? How do we get in front of more customers? How does marketing and press play into all of that? How do we do the right branding and positioning so people understand what kind of a product we're building and what kind of a use case it solves, especially when we're defining a new type of product. So this is not something that already exists and we're trying to build a better version of it. It's like, this is a new category. So how do we get people to understand that? So I would say like still, I don't know, like 90% of the work is very much like just startup execution, building a product, building a team, building a business. And that part is still very fun to me as somebody who has been in startups, and like I think of myself as a builder. Like I still identify as an engineer, even if I'm not writing code day to day anymore. I was just checking my GitHub profile the other day, and I haven't written code for the last 5 months. I've had to make more of a transition over to like more of the business side and running the business. But I still think of myself as an engineer and a builder, and even if it's not in the form of like literally writing the code, I'm still building the team and building our processes and building something. So yeah, that's a lot of the day to day. Sometimes it is just working through the tedium of, we made a bad decision on the technical side 2 years ago, and now we have to figure out how to unbreak that bad decision of, I don't know, making a copy of a third-party library and not having it be up to date, and now need to pull down like thousands of updates from this library, or figuring out business things like, how do we generate our first invoices for enterprise clients, and how do we set up the payments? But yeah, all of it is fun. It's sort of startup life of, you have to do everything and be very flexible to learn new skills at any time.
So I hope folks are taking notes, because I think Tracy covered a lot of good stuff. From my experience, I think you touched on all the important stuff. Any final thoughts on idealists getting into tech? Maybe look into your career as a roadmap. Any final words of wisdom?
I think the tech industry needs more idealists and more folks to push us to be uncomfortable and in better directions. And so I'm very excited for more idealists coming in, but I also just want everyone to make sure to take care of themselves as well and be able to identify what is important in the personal capacity before necessarily making big sacrifices for the industry.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks so much for having me.